October 1st, 331 BC. Persian King Darius III commanded one of the most monumental armies ever assembled in the ancient world. Over 100,000 men, scythed chariots, war elephants, and cavalry from 15 nations. Facing him across the plains of Gaugamela stood Alexander the Great, with barely 47,000 soldiers. The Persians outnumbered the Macedonians more than 2 to 1. Darius had chosen the battlefield himself, spent months preparing it, and held every conceivable advantage. Yet within hours, he would make a decision so catastrophic it would kickstart a chain of events that would end the Persian Empire forever. This is the story of how one man's fatal error transformed certain victory into legendary defeat. Two years earlier, Darius had already faced Alexander once before at the Battle of Issus and fled. That defeat had been humiliating, but Darius blamed the narrow coastal terrain that neutralized his numerical advantage. This time would be different. The Persian king spent months selecting the perfect battlefield near the village of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. He ordered his engineers to flatten the ground, removing every rock, bush, and obstacle that might impede his cavalry and chariots. He even had the earth smoothed and leveled like a parade ground. Darius was building not just an army, but a killing floor, designed specifically to destroy the Macedonian phalanx. But was he preparing for the battle he wanted, or the battle Alexander would give him? Alexander arrived at Gaugamela in September 331 BC, and what he saw should have terrified him. The Persian army stretched across the horizon like an ocean of spears and banners. Darius had assembled forces from across his empire: Bactrian cavalry, Indian elephants, Armenian infantry, Scythian horse archers, and the elite Persian immortals. At the center were 200 scythed chariots, their wheels fitted with razor-sharp blades designed to slice through packed infantry formations. These weren't just vehicles. They were mobile killing machines that had broken armies before. Darius's generals were confident. They had the numbers, the ground, and a trap ready to spring. But Alexander didn't react the way they expected. Instead of attacking immediately, Alexander did something that unnerved the Persians. He made camp and waited. For 4 days, the Macedonian king studied the battlefield while his men rested. Darius, meanwhile, kept his massive army in battle formation day and night, convinced Alexander would launch a surprise night attack. The Persian soldiers stood in their positions, unable to rest, growing more exhausted with each passing day. Alexander's generals urged him to attack under cover of darkness when the tired Persians would be most vulnerable. But Alexander refused, allegedly saying he would not steal victory like a thief. Was this honor speaking, or was Alexander deliberately wearing down his enemy's nerves? On the night before battle, while Darius's army stood at attention in the darkness, Alexander's men slept soundly. The Persian king, paranoid about a night assault, kept his entire force awake and armed. By dawn on October 1st, the Persian soldiers had been standing for hours, hungry and exhausted, watching the Macedonian camp. Then Alexander's army emerged in perfect formation, refreshed and ready. The psychological advantage had already begun to shift. Darius watched from his command chariot at the center of his line as the Macedonians advanced in their characteristic oblique formation. But something was wrong. Instead of marching straight toward the Persian center, Alexander's entire army was drifting to the right. This wasn't a mistake. It was calculated. Alexander was moving his army laterally across the battlefield, away from the carefully prepared ground Darius had spent months clearing. Every step took the Macedonians closer to the rough, uneven terrain at the edge of the killing floor. Darius faced an impossible choice. If he let Alexander reach that broken ground, the Persian cavalry and chariots would lose their advantage. The entire point of choosing Gaugamela would be wasted. But if Darius ordered his line to shift left to match Alexander's movement, he would stretch his formation thinner and thinner. The Persian king decided he couldn't allow Alexander to escape the trap. He ordered his left wing, commanded by the Scythian and Bactrian cavalry, to extend further left to envelop Alexander's right. He was doing exactly what Alexander wanted. As the Persian line stretched to counter Alexander's drift, Darius gave the order he thought would end the battle. Unleash the scythed chariots. 200 chariots thundered forward, blade-fitted wheels spinning toward the Macedonian phalanx. These weapons had shattered infantry formations across Asia. The ground shook as they charged. But Alexander had spent years studying Persian tactics. His men didn't stand frozen in terror as other armies had. Instead, the Macedonian phalanx executed a drill they'd practiced countless times. They opened their ranks. The chariots thundered through the gaps harmlessly, while javelin, men, and archers positioned in the intervals cut down the drivers. Those chariots that made it through found themselves behind enemy lines with nowhere to go, surrounded and neutralized. In minutes, Darius's superweapon had been completely negated. While some chariots did cause horrific casualties, they ultimately failed to break the phalanx's formation, leaving Darius's master plan in tatters. What else had the Persian king not anticipated? Then Alexander saw it. The gap. As the Persian left wing extended to match his rightward drift, and as the center committed the chariots forward, a small opening appeared in the Persian line between the left wing and the center. It was exactly what Alexander had been maneuvering to create. Without hesitation, Alexander personally led his elite companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly at this gap. They moved with such speed and precision that the Persian commanders barely had time to react. Alexander wasn't targeting the Persian flanks or trying to win by attrition. He was driving like a spear point directly toward Darius himself, hundreds of yards behind the Persian front line. This wasn't just bold, it was suicidal if it failed. The companion cavalry smashed through the gap with Alexander at their head, cutting through Persian infantry like a sword through cloth. Behind them, the Macedonian phalanx advanced in their wake, widening the breach. Suddenly, instead of commanding from a safe position in the rear, Darius found enemy cavalry thundering directly toward his command post. The Persian king could see Alexander himself leading the charge, barely 50 yards away and closing. Darius's personal guards formed a desperate shield wall, but they were being cut down. The King of Kings, ruler of the largest empire on earth, faced a split-second decision. Around him, his advisors and generals looked to him for orders. The battle wasn't lost. The Persian right wing was actually winning, breaking through the Macedonian left. If Darius stood his ground and rallied his center, if he trusted his numerical superiority and the discipline of his troops, the battle could still be won. But Darius looked at Alexander's face across the clash of swords and made his choice. He ran. For the second time in 2 years, Darius III wheeled his chariot around and fled the battlefield. His personal guards abandoned their positions to escort him to safety. Within minutes, word spread through the Persian center. The king has fled. The psychological impact was instantaneous and cataclysmic. If their divine king, their supposed center of strength, had abandoned them, what chance did common soldiers have? The Persian center, which had been holding firm despite the Macedonian penetration, began to waver. Officers looked around for orders that wouldn't come. The disciplined formation started to fragment. And once it began, the collapse accelerated like an avalanche. Alexander wanted to pursue Darius immediately. He was so close to capturing the Persian king and ending the war in one stroke, but his own left wing was in trouble. The Persian right cavalry, led by Mazaeus, had broken through and was threatening to encircle the entire Macedonian army. Alexander faced his own terrible choice: pursue Darius and risk losing his entire left wing, or abandon the chase to save his army. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back to rescue his left flank. Meanwhile, Darius didn't stop running until he reached the city of Arbela, 75 miles away. He'd lost his army, his treasury, his royal tent, and whatever remained of his credibility. But the consequences of his panic would extend far beyond one battlefield. The Battle of Gaugamela was over by mid-afternoon. Persian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Macedonian losses were perhaps 500 men. Within weeks, Babylon opened its gates to Alexander without resistance. Susa fell next, then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, was captured and burned. Darius fled further east, desperately trying to raise a new army, but his own nobles had seen enough. In 330 BC, his general Bessus murdered him, hoping to win favor with Alexander. The assassination failed to save Bessus. Alexander hunted him down and executed him, but it confirmed that Darius's flight at Gaugamela had destroyed not just his army, but his authority. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the ancient world for over 200 years, ceased to exist. An army of between 100,000 and 250,000 had been outfought and outmaneuvered by a force a fraction of their size. One decision, one moment of panic, had rewritten history. So what can we learn from Darius's disastrous failure at Gaugamela? 1. Preparation without adaptation is useless. Darius spent months preparing the perfect battlefield based on how he thought Alexander should fight. He created ideal conditions for his own preferred tactics, but showed no flexibility when Alexander refused to cooperate. The Persian king prepared for the battle he wanted, rather than anticipating the battle his enemy would actually give him. In any competition, military, business, or personal, success comes not from perfect conditions, but from adapting when your opponent doesn't follow your script. 2. Numerical advantage means nothing without leadership in the critical moment. Darius commanded more than twice as many soldiers as Alexander, with superior cavalry and exotic weapons his enemy lacked. On paper, Persian victory was inevitable. But when Alexander penetrated to the Persian command position, Darius's nerve failed. His flight didn't just remove him from the battlefield. It removed the command structure that held his entire army together. A leader who abandons their position in the moment of crisis transforms advantages into liabilities. The larger the organization, the more calamitous the impact when leadership fails. 3. Psychological warfare is as important as physical warfare. Alexander deliberately rested his troops while forcing Darius's army to stand at attention for days. He made Darius paranoid about night attacks. He marched his men across the battlefield in full view, forcing the Persian king to make increasingly desperate decisions. By the time the actual fighting began, Alexander had already won a significant victory in Darius's mind. The perception of threat can be as paralyzing as the threat itself, and an anxious enemy makes mistakes a confident one never would. 4. The enemy's strength can become their weakness. Darius's massive army, his pride, and his advantage became his greatest vulnerability. The larger his force, the harder it was to maneuver, and the more it relied on complex coordination. When Alexander created a gap in that line, the sheer size of the Persian army meant communication broke down across vast distances. Commanders on the flanks didn't know what was happening at the center. By the time they learned their king had fled, it was too late to reorganize. Sometimes the very assets we think make us invulnerable create the most spectacular failures when pressure is applied at just the right point. 5. Panic is contagious, especially from the top down. When Darius fled, he didn't just save himself, he killed thousands of his soldiers who would have survived if the army had maintained cohesion. His terror infected his guards, who infected the nearby units, who infected the entire center. Within an hour, an army that outnumbered its enemy 2-1 was in full rout. Leadership sets the emotional tone for everyone below. One person's fear, especially at the top, can cascade into institutional collapse faster than any external attack. Darius didn't lose at Gaugamela because his army was defeated. His army was defeated because he lost his nerve. Gaugamela wasn't just a military disaster. It was a case study in how advantages crumble when leadership fails, when planning becomes rigid, and when fear displaces reason at the crucial moment. Darius III had everything he needed to win except the one thing that mattered most: the courage to stand his ground when the enemy reached him. Alexander understood something Darius never did. Battles aren't won by whoever has the most soldiers, but by whoever refuses to blink when everything is on the line. In the end, the Persian Empire fell not because it was weak, but because at the moment of maximum danger, when history hung in the balance, its king chose flight over fight. And once that choice was made, no amount of preparation, no numerical superiority, no perfect battlefield could save what was already lost.